There is a town in the mountains of West Virginia where 15 passenger trains once rolled through every single day. Where a single hotel handled more high-stakes card games than anywhere else in the state. Where the freight yards processed more tonnage than the yards of Cincinnati and Richmond combined. Today, you can stand in the middle of that town's main street at noon and hear nothing but wind moving through empty windows. 5 people live there now. 5. And if you told any of its residents in 1910 that their booming railroad capital would one day be visited mostly by ghost hunters and photographers, they would have laughed you out of town. This is the story of what happens when the very thing that builds a town also has the power to erase it. Across the United States, thousands of towns were born because a railroad decided to stop there. And thousands of towns died because a railroad decided to stop somewhere else. This isn't a story about nostalgia. It's a story about power, the power of a single corporate decision, made in a boardroom hundreds of miles away, to create prosperity in one place and abandon it in another. And by the end of this journey, you'll understand why so many of these towns disappeared almost overnight, why a handful still cling to life today, and why the pattern that destroyed them a century ago is still playing out in different forms right now. To understand how a town could vanish because of a train, you first have to understand how much power the railroad held over the American landscape in the first place. In the second half of the 19th century, the railroad wasn't just a form of transportation. It was the decision-maker for where America would live. Before a rail line was built, a stretch of prairie or desert or forest was just empty land. The moment a survey crew staked out a route, that same land became valuable. Investors rushed in. Land speculators bought up plots along the proposed line, betting that a depot would be built nearby. Entire towns were platted on paper before a single building existed, all based on a rumor of where the tracks might run. And when the railroad companies actually chose their route, the towns that found themselves along that line exploded with growth. A depot meant mail service. It meant freight could move in and out. It meant grain elevators, stockyards, hotels, saloons, banks, and eventually schools and churches. In the Great Plains alone, the Kansas State Historical Society has documented roughly 6,000 attempted town sites, many of them built purely on the gamble that the railroad would come through. Most of those 6,000 never became more than a name on a map. But the ones that got lucky became the backbone of rural America. Here's the part that most people don't realize, though. The railroad companies weren't just laying track to connect existing towns. Very often, they were the ones deciding which towns got to exist at all. If a railroad survey crew decided that a particular ridge or riverbank offered a better grade for the tracks, they would simply route around an existing settlement and build their own depot a few miles away. And when that happened, something remarkable occurred. The old town didn't fight to survive in place. It packed up and moved. In Kansas, this happened almost exactly the way it sounds. When the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway bypassed the settlements of Lanesfield and McCamish by just a few miles in 1870, the response wasn't panic, it was relocation. Stores were physically disassembled or dragged on rollers to the new rail corridor. Homes were moved. Even the post office picked up and left. Within a short time, Lanesfield and McCamish were empty lots, their populations and their entire commercial districts transplanted to whichever town the railroad had chosen to favor instead. It's a strange thing to imagine, an entire main street, walking away from its own location because the tracks went somewhere else. Oklahoma tells a similar story, but with an even sharper edge. When the Missouri, Kansas and Texas Railroad bypassed the town of Boggy Depot in 1872, the community had no ability to negotiate, no leverage, no say in the matter. The railroad simply chose a different path, and Boggy Depot began to wither. Decades later, the town of Parkersburg, Oklahoma had grown to 700 residents by 1901, a thriving little community with every sign of a durable future. Within 3 years, it was a ghost town, because the railroad chose to run its line through the town of Clinton instead. 3 years. That's how fast a town of 700 people could be reduced to nothing, simply because a corporate surveyor's map pointed 12 miles in a different direction. What's haunting about these stories is how little the railroad companies had to do to kill a town. They didn't need to burn it down. They didn't need to force anyone out. They just needed to withhold a depot. Without a stop on the line, a town had no way to ship its grain, no way to receive its mail efficiently, no way to draw travelers or commerce. The town would simply starve, slowly, as its businesses closed one by one and its residents drifted toward whichever town the railroad had chosen to bless instead. But bypassing a town before it fully took root was only one way a railroad could end a community. The far more dramatic story, the one that produced some of America's most famous ghost towns, is what happened to towns that the railroad built, used, and then simply no longer needed. Picture the American West in the age of steam. A locomotive in the 1880s couldn't just travel indefinitely. Steam engines needed water, and they needed it often, sometimes every 20 or 30 miles, depending on the terrain and the load. In the deserts of Utah, Nevada, and Arizona, where natural water sources were scarce, the railroad companies had to build their own water stations at careful intervals along the line, just to keep their locomotives running. And wherever the railroad built a water stop, a town tended to grow up around it, almost like a seed finding soil. This is exactly how the town of Cisco, Utah came into existence. In the 1880s, the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad pushed its line through the high desert of eastern Utah, and Cisco was established purely as a watering stop for thirsty steam locomotives. At first it was barely more than a water tank and a small depot. But work crews needed food and lodging. Travelers needed a place to rest. Ranchers in the nearby Book Cliffs began driving their sheep and cattle to Cisco because the rail line offered the fastest way to get livestock to market. At its peak, an almost unbelievable number of sheep, as many as 100,000, were sheared in Cisco in a single season. They were loaded straight onto freight cars. For decades, Cisco thrived in that quiet, unglamorous way that service towns often do. It wasn't a boomtown built on gold or silver. It was built on water, wool, and cattle. Then, in 1924, oil and natural gas were discovered nearby, and Cisco briefly became the largest producer of both in the entire state of Utah. Gas stations, hotels, and restaurants sprang up almost overnight to serve post-war Americans who were, for the first time in large numbers, taking to the highways in their own automobiles. By the 1940s, roughly 200 people called Cisco home. It even received its own zip code. For a town built around a water tank, that was no small achievement. And then, in the span of about a decade, everything that had sustained Cisco simply stopped mattering. In the 1950s, American railroads underwent one of the most sweeping technological transitions in their history, the wholesale replacement of steam locomotives with diesel engines. Diesel locomotives didn't need to stop every few dozen miles for water. They could run for hundreds of miles without refueling. Almost overnight, the entire reason Cisco existed, its water tower, its depot, its role as a life support station for thirsty steam engines, became obsolete. The very infrastructure that had built the town was rendered meaningless by an engine upgrade. Cisco held on for a while longer, propped up by a brief uranium and vanadium mining boom that drew prospectors into the desert during the Cold War. But when that mining rush fizzled out, there was nothing left to hold the town together. And then came the final blow. In the 1970s, Interstate 70 was built through the region, and it bypassed Cisco entirely. The highway that could have saved the town, the way it saved so many others, instead sealed its fate. Today, Cisco sits just off the interstate, its buildings collapsing slowly into the desert floor, visited mainly by ghost town photographers and, memorably, used as a filming location for the 1971 movie, Vanishing Point. According to the 2020 census, precisely 4 people still live there. 4. In a town that once sheared 100,000 sheep in a single season. If Cisco's death was caused by an engine upgrade, the death of Thurmond, West Virginia is a story of something even harder to watch, a town that had every reason to believe it was permanent, built on an industry that seemed like it would never end. Thurmond was founded in 1873, when a former Confederate cavalry officer named Captain William D. Thurmond was granted 73 acres of land along the newly completed main line of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway, deep in the New River Gorge. For over a decade, only a single house stood on the site. But the region sat atop something extraordinarily valuable, New River smokeless coal, a high-grade fuel prized by industry and the U.S. Navy alike. Once large-scale mining began, Thurmond transformed almost overnight from a lonely riverside outpost into the beating industrial heart of the entire gorge. By 1910, Thurmond had become the chief railroad center on the Chesapeake and Ohio's main line. 15 passenger trains rolled through every single day, along with a relentless stream of coal cars hauling New River smokeless coal out to a hungry nation. The town's freight volume was staggering. By some accounts, Thurmond processed more tonnage than the yards of Cincinnati and Richmond put together. Money flowed through Thurmond the way coal flowed through its yards. The town's banks did more business than almost any other stop on the line. And just outside the town's official limits, in a rowdier district that skirted the strict rules Captain Thurmond had imposed inside his town, the infamous Dun Glen Hotel ran a card game that, according to local legend, went on continuously for over a decade without ever stopping. Prospectors, railroad men, and gamblers poured in and out around the clock. But even in the middle of that roaring prosperity, the seeds of Thurmond's decline were already being planted, and they had nothing to do with the coal running out. In 1930, a fire, one that many at the time suspected was arson, burned the Dun Glen Hotel to the ground, taking with it the wild, round-the-clock nightlife that had defined the town's rowdier edge. It was, in hindsight, an early warning sign of a much larger unraveling. The Great Depression hit Thurmond hard, and a series of additional fires tore through its commercial district over the following year, forcing the town's National Bank to close its doors permanently in 1931. Thurmond limped forward through the 1930s and 40s, still tethered to coal, still a working railroad town, but never again reaching the feverish heights of its 1910 peak. And then, in 1949, the same technological shift that would later doom Cisco arrived in the Appalachian Mountains. The Chesapeake and Ohio Railway switched from steam locomotives to diesel. Diesel engines didn't need to stop at Thurmond for water and coal the way steam engines had for 3/4 of a century. The rail yard that had once been the busiest stretch of track in the gorge simply had nothing left to service. Jobs vanished. Businesses that depended on railroad workers and travelers passing through had no reason to stay open. Over the following decades, the population that had once supported a bustling commercial district dwindled to a number so small it's almost hard to comprehend. By the most recent census, just 5 people call Thurmond home. What makes Thurmond's story different from so many other faded railroad towns is what happened next. Instead of being bulldozed or left to rot into total obscurity, Thurmond was absorbed into the National Park Service in the late 1970s as part of what is now the New River Gorge National Park and Preserve. The Park Service now owns roughly 80% of the town's remaining structures. In 1995, the old Chesapeake and Ohio Depot, the very building that once processed 15 trains a day, was restored and reopened as a visitor center. Remarkably, Amtrak still makes a scheduled stop in Thurmond 3 times a week, meaning you can, right now, buy a ticket and ride a train into a town that most of America has completely forgotten exists. Over 20 of Thurmond's original buildings still stand along its quiet, weathered streets, preserved not because the town found a way to survive, but because it died in a way that made it worth remembering. There's something almost poetic in that. Thurmond didn't get to keep its purpose. But it got to keep its shape. Most towns aren't so lucky. Because for every Thurmond, there are dozens of forgotten railroad towns across the northern Great Plains, in Montana, Nebraska, North Dakota, and South Dakota, that simply vanished without ceremony, without preservation, without a National Park Service to step in. Historians estimate that rural areas of the Great Plains have lost roughly 1/3 of their total population since 1920. Thousands of these communities became what researchers now call railroad ghost towns, places where a promised rail line simply never materialized, or where a line that did arrive was later ripped out entirely as freight patterns shifted and branch lines became unprofitable to maintain. When a railroad company decided a spur line was no longer worth the cost of upkeep, it could file for abandonment, pull up the rails, and walk away, and the town that had organized its entire existence around that thin ribbon of steel had almost no way to survive the loss. In some cases, the collapse could be sudden and almost cinematic in how completely it dismantled a place. In Steins, New Mexico, when trains stopped running through the town in 1944, the community lost not only its economic lifeline but its actual water supply, which had been provided by the railroad. Mining operations that depended on rail shipping collapsed almost immediately. Hotels shuttered their doors. And in a scene that sounds almost too dramatic to be true, residents of at least one similarly stranded railroad town were reported to have evacuated on the very last train to ever leave the station, boarding with whatever belongings they could carry, watching their homes shrink into the distance for the final time. It's worth pausing here to ask why this pattern repeated itself so relentlessly across the American landscape, in so many different states, for so many different reasons. Because underneath the specific details, steam versus diesel, one rail route versus another, a fire here, a bypass there, there's a single truth running through every one of these stories. These towns never controlled their own destiny. Their prosperity was never something they built entirely for themselves. It was granted to them, almost as a byproduct, by a distant railroad company making decisions based on grade angles, water availability, freight efficiency, and shareholder profit. When those calculations changed, the town's fate changed with them, and there was rarely anything the residents could do about it. Compare that to the ghost towns created by mining busts, which at least had a kind of internal logic that residents could see coming. A vein of silver or gold runs dry, and everyone understands, on some level, why the town is dying. But a railroad town's death often arrived from somewhere its residents couldn't even see, a boardroom decision in Denver or New York, a new engine technology being adopted 1,000 miles away, a highway planner in the 1950s choosing to route Interstate 70 a few miles south of where the old road used to run. The people living in these towns often had no idea their entire way of life was being decided by people who had never even visited. And that pattern didn't stop with the railroad era. It simply changed shape. The exact same dynamic, outside decision-makers rerouting the flow of commerce and stranding communities that once depended on it, repeated itself when the interstate highway system bypassed hundreds of towns that had built their economies around U.S. Route 66 and other historic highways. Motels, diners, and gas stations that had thrived for decades along Route 66 withered within a few short years once faster interstates like I-44 and I-40 routed traffic around them entirely. It's almost the same story wearing different clothes. The railroad town of the 1880s and the Route 66 town of the 1960s met remarkably similar fates, for remarkably similar reasons. So what do you actually see if you go looking for these places today? It depends entirely on which kind of ending a particular town received. Some, like Thurmond, were fortunate enough to be preserved, protected, and turned into living museums of a vanished era, where visitors can walk streets that look almost exactly as they did a century ago. Others, like Cisco, exist in a kind of slow-motion collapse, buildings still standing, roofs caving in one at a time, walls covered in decades of graffiti left by explorers and photographers who come seeking exactly the eerie stillness these places now offer. And still others left almost nothing behind at all, a foundation here, a rusted rail spike there, a name on an old county map that no longer corresponds to anything a traveler could find by car. What's remarkable is how many of these towns refuse to disappear completely, even now. In Cisco, a handful of residents have stayed, and in recent years an artist residency program has taken root there, drawing creative people who are, in their own way, trying to write a new chapter onto a place the rest of America wrote off decades ago. A small general store even reopened near the old Cisco boat ramp, offering supplies to boaters and travelers on the Colorado River, a faint echo of the commerce that once defined the town. It's a reminder that even in the most thoroughly abandoned places, some fragile thread of continuation can survive if a handful of people are stubborn enough to hold on to it. And that, in the end, might be the most important thing these forgotten railroad towns can teach us. They aren't really stories about trains, or diesel engines, or corporate route decisions. They're stories about the fragility of prosperity itself, about how quickly a place that feels permanent, that feels like the center of the world to the people living in it, can become an afterthought the moment the system supporting it move on without warning. Every one of these towns believed, in its own moment of prosperity, that its position was secure. Thurmond had 15 trains a day. Cisco had its own zip code. Parkersburg had 700 residents and every sign of a growing future. None of that mattered once the decision that built them stopped applying. It's tempting to look at these places as relics of a distant, unrepeatable past, quaint casualties of steam engines and horse and buggy economics that have nothing to do with the world we live in now. But that would be missing the deeper pattern entirely. Every era has its own version of the railroad company deciding a town's fate from a distance. Every era has its own technology that quietly renders a way of life obsolete, its own infrastructure decision made by people who will never set foot in the community it reshapes. The forgotten railroad towns of America aren't just artifacts of the 1800s. They're an early, visible chapter in a story that has never actually stopped being written. Walk the empty streets of Thurmond today, and you can still see the outline of the world that money and momentum built there, the bank, the depot, the hotel foundations along the river. Stand in Cisco's crumbling gas station, its pumps rusted solid, its windows shattered by decades of desert wind, and you're standing inside the physical remains of a decision made in a distant office, one that no resident of that town ever got a vote on. These places are not just ghost towns. They're monuments to the exact moment progress moved on and simply forgot to look back. If your own hometown, or a town near where you grew up, had its fate decided by a factory closing, a highway bypass, or a company simply moving on, what was it like to watch that happen, and do you think anything could have saved it?